Well, Tulsa is the site of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, which is arguably the single worst incident of domestic racial violence in American history. But the massacre in Tulsa destroyed what was called Black Wall Street, the incredible economic and entrepreneurial community in Tulsa that was founded in 1906. So there were a number of systemic factors and national contextual factors that led to what happened in Tulsa in 1921. Historians and sociologists often talk about the early part of the 20th century in America as the nadir of race relations in America. Nadir is a word that just means low point, because there were a proliferation of so-called race riots. These were mostly assaults on black communities, and because of the prevalence of lynching. Lynching is a form of domestic terrorism aimed primarily at African Americans. So all these things were happening in the early part of the 20th century. If we look at just 2 years prior, 1919, James Weldon Johnson of the NAACP described the summer and fall of 1919 as Red Summer. Red is a metaphorical reference to blood, mostly black blood, flowing in the streets of American cities, because there were more than 24 major events, again called race riots, in America in 1919, in New York and Philadelphia, in Washington, D.C. and Chicago, in Omaha and Elaine, Arkansas, and Longview, Texas, and on and on and on. So all these things happened in the run-up to the tragedy here in Tulsa in 1921. Add to that the presence of the Klan in Oklahoma and in Tulsa generally in the 1920s, swelling in the late 1920s, the desire on the part of industrialists and railroad interests to take the land in Greenwood, I call it land lust, that existed in Tulsa, and the role of the media, particularly a media outlet called the Tulsa Tribune, a daily afternoon newspaper, that published a series of incendiary, inflammatory articles and editorials that really fanned the flames of hostility and racial hatred in sectors of the white community. Tulsa was a tinderbox in 1921, needing only some sort of catalyst to set the community alight. And that catalyst was an event involving two teenagers, a black boy, 19 years old, Dick Rowland, white girl, 17 years old, Sarah Page. Dick Rowland needed to use the restroom. It's Monday, May 30th, 1921, Memorial Day. He knows that facilities are segregated. He goes down to the Drexel building downtown, enters the building, boards the elevator, being manually operated by young Sarah Page, 17 years old. Something happened in the elevator. We don't know exactly what happened. We'll never know. Caused the elevator to jerk or to lurch. Dick Rowland bumped into, maybe brushed up against, or stepped on the foot of Sarah Page. She began to scream. She overreacted. He ran from the elevator when it landed back in the lobby. He was frightened. She was distraught. She told her story to a store clerk from Renberg's, a locally owned store. He was alarmed, and he called the police. She would later recant that original story, but the original story was that she'd been assaulted by Dick Rowland. Had it not been for the intervention of the Tulsa Tribune the next day, things might have calmed. But the Tulsa Tribune ran a story entitled "Nabbed Negro for Attacking Girl in an Elevator." It was a false narrative, really a tale of an attempted rape in broad daylight in a public building in downtown Tulsa, a story that went out of its way to make Sarah Page, the white girl, look virtuous, and as a corollary, make Dick Rowland, the black boy, look villainous. So, a large white mob began to gather on the lawn of the courthouse. Dick Rowland was arrested, put on the top floor in the jail. The white mob numbered ultimately in the thousands. A group of black men, several dozen in number, some of them World War I veterans with weapons who knew how to use those weapons. Well, they were concerned about Dick Rowland's safety. They'd heard that there was going to be a lynching that night. So they marched down to the courthouse and confronted the white mob. Words were exchanged. White man tried to take a black man's gun. The gun discharged. And in the words of some of the right survivors, or the massacre survivors, all hell broke loose after that. When the dust settled, we believe that somewhere between 100 and 300 people, most of them black, were killed. At least 1,250 homes in the black community were destroyed, as were a number of commercial establishments. Many black families were rounded up and taken to internment centers throughout the city, very much like people of Japanese ancestry were interned during World War II. The Red Cross provided immediate relief, health care, food, shelter, clothing, etc. Now, black men had put up a really robust but short-lived defense of the black community initially, but they were just outnumbered and overrun by armed white men, some of whom had been deputized by local law enforcement officers. The white mob, actually prevented the fire department, firemen, from putting out fires that were raging in the Greenwood community. And we know that planes flew overhead, likely privately owned, that at a minimum strafed the community with bullets, and according to many eyewitnesses, dropped incendiary devices, nitroglycerin, kerosene, or something, that caused the flames to spread more rapidly and burn more brilliantly. The story here really, though, is the story of the human spirit, the indomitable human spirit, because these black folks began rebuilding even as the embers still smoldered from the massacre. The community was rebuilt substantially by 1925 when it hosted the National Negro Business League National Conference of essentially the Black Chamber of Commerce founded by Booker T. Washington. The black business community peaks in Tulsa. Black Wall Street rises again in the early to mid 1940s and declines in the 60s, 70s, and 80s on account of integration, urban renewal, changes in the economy, and such. And today we have a different kind of integrated community that's really an amalgam of residential, commercial, educational, entertainment, religious, and other interests, including cultural interests like the Greenwood Cultural Center in which we sit doing this interview.